So on today's episode of The Parent Equation, I'm so thrilled to be joined by Hanson Lee. Hanson is the founder of DaddiLife and was an ex-marketer, similar to myself. I think we will be stretched for time today because there is a ton of stuff that I want to talk to you about, Hanson. So welcome and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be on.
Good. So let us start from the beginning, I think. And the beginning is you were in a corporate background in marketing agency side, and then you are now the founder, full-time founder of DaddiLife. So where did that journey, how did that journey happen? What was the catalyst for that change for you?
That's a great question. So as you said, I have a predominantly marketing-based background. So I started with the Co-op, actually, of all places, up in Manchester, many, many years than I care to admit ago. In a sort of client-side role. I was actually a food buyer, which was actually my first role, which was a brilliant role to really get grounded into the sort of realities of organizational business life. And then since then, my role in marketing is really flexed from research and strategy and advertising across sort of CRM, TV ads, pretty much every single channel, actually. And I love marketing. Like I'm a real marketeer at heart. And when I became a dad, I was very conscious, and I'm a dad to a very boisterous 7-year-old now, and I was very conscious of wanting to be a very different and just frankly better dad than what I had growing up. And I was, product of very early divorce, my own parents. I was raised essentially by a single mum, who is still to this day like my hero. Yeah. And I think I was very, very conscious of just being a better dad, which, to be really honest with you, the bar was relatively low. So I think just being around was probably just like something. But no, I was really, really conscious of just being everything that I really didn't have and trying to be the best I could for my son. But everywhere I looked, I found that all roads were really pointing back to mum. Yeah. And there were some great resources out there, but I just felt there wasn't necessarily a place there were great dad bloggers. I still look at people like John Adams, for instance, and I just love his work. And there were some brilliant dad bloggers, but there wasn't necessarily a more collective space about fatherhood more collectively across the whole generation. And so DaddiLife started as a small community online. It's grown now to a community of just over 150,000 dads. And we've supported that over the last sort of five and a half years now, with a platform and a community. We've recently gone into publishing, and also we do a lot of work with organizations around how we can start to look at more equality around that cultural barrier for dads at work.
And do you think then, talking about your early experience of fatherhood and the resources available, I completely agree. I remember that when we had our first daughter 11 years ago now, and my husband was faced with the same challenges, sort of what is this going to be, being a new dad, and all of the books and the resources seem to be treating potential or new fathers as dummies, sort of dummies guide to fatherhood, and you can still go out for beers, but just make sure that you're there to change a nappy or something. It was a kind of quite old school traditional view still, even though this is in the 2000s. And is that what you found? Hence what led you to DaddiLife?
Absolutely. And I think even beyond or before books, just widely in terms of internet content and just how we were communicating about what parenthood is and isn't, it was still a predominantly mum's world. And I think dads have, up until recently, I'd say, over the last 5 to 10 years, were still very much treated and I think perceived as a sort of secondary parent. And more recently, we've gone into publishing. And what you said, it was the exact catalyst of actually writing our own book, in that what we found is that even though there are a few, and some very, very good, dad pregnancy books, most of them have, and it's still ironic to this day to me, that actually they're writing for an audience that is about fatherhood, but actually tonally talking about actually treating them still like a secondary parent, and saying things like, just don't forget to put the beers away, and things like that. And I think what we've seen is that dads have gone through this generational shift where they want to be more involved, they want to be an equal parent. And I think COVID has really accelerated that, and it's opened their eyes of not just modern day men and sort of millennial age sort of downwards, but actually across a much wider spectrum of fatherhood as a whole. And that was very much the catalyst of writing our own book. So we wrote a book called You're Going to Be a Dad, which is a new father's guide to pregnancy in the first year of fatherhood. And in that, we've taken a very different view of how men and dads want to actually be told about pregnancy, the questions they have, and also that it's far from a one size fits all. Very much like motherhood or parenthood as a whole. And so what we've done is we've interviewed just over 50 dads, from those who've conceived naturally to those who've gone through IVF, or dads of twins, or various different backgrounds, just to shine a much more diverse picture. And all of their reflections are actually mapped to specific stages of the pregnancy, so that you can just get a sense of not just a vanilla type of this is what happens, but actually this is what happened for this sort of dad in this sort of context versus this sort of dad in this other context. And touch wood, it's become a bestseller in the US and the UK. I think and some of the feedback has been so humbling in terms of how it's really helped dads and mums, actually, because at the core of it, we've written it so that dads and mums can be together as one team. I think that one team perspective is so important to our own mission too.
And I think it's that diversity, as you just mentioned, diversity of experiences and perspectives that show fathers and mothers that it's okay to speak out, it's okay to ask for help. There are plenty of other people in the same boat as you. And where you might think you're not in a normal situation, so perhaps you've gone down the IVF route, or it's not the sort of vanilla textbook route to parenthood, which I don't think anyone actually goes through the textbook route to parenthood anyway. But it shows you then that there are plenty of other people out there willing to support you if you just sort of put your hand up and say, can I have a bit of help, please?
Well, you're absolutely right, because even for myself, I've talked to and interviewed hundreds, if not thousands, of dads across the last 5 years. But even doing this project, it was amazing actually just to learn the depth of some of the challenges and struggles that dads go through that we don't often lift the lid on. So even things like postpartum depression for men, recent studies have shown that as many as 1 in 10 new dads actually do go through that experience. And actually, it was great to get a real insight from a number of dads, both in the US, UK, and Australia, about what the catalyst was for them and their own postpartum depression, and actually what they then did to manage that through. And so many of them anyway, talked about how they were holding on to this sense of guilt and actually feeling that they didn't deserve to feel any other way but joyful, because it was the mother in the majority of the cases that had gone through such a huge biological and physical change. But actually holding on to that guilt and not talking about it was actually really eating them up inside, and was prolonging some deeper challenges too. But pretty much all of them had said that once they found the solution for them to have the safe space and to have the conversation with their partners, all of them have reported far, far, far better relationships as a result. They've had nothing but understanding from their partners. I think that's comes back to that sense of being one team. How can we start to open up those conversations, because some of those conversations just don't happen enough. And I think one of those things definitely around mental health and physical health, but even things like leave, like parental leave. It's amazing how many people go into those situations with assumptions about what each other thinks each other might want or deserve. And there's a lack of conversation around there for sure. So hopefully this book has started to just be a bit of a catalyst for people to have more of those conversations.
Well, if it's a bestseller, then it's definitely the catalyst. It means people are buying it, some people are reading it. So there's no better place to start, is there, than being a bestseller here and across the pond?
Yeah, I mean, it's not even, you're absolutely right, but I think for me, the thing that really humble, I know this can sound a little bit blue skyish, but it really, when I just hear feedback and we get a sense of how it's helping people, honestly, that for me is real success.
So let's talk a bit more about DaddiLife itself. So you've mentioned already that it's a platform for dads to engage, get support, find the right resources for them, etc. And it's obviously taken you on a journey from a part-time alongside your day job to a full-time role. So that in itself, going from, I suppose, corporate world to self-employed working dad, how does that feel?
How does that feel? Very good question. Well, I've been involved with a few different ventures in my time. So when I first moved to London, I just set up a food tech company called Loaf, which was a brilliant technology that we created that essentially visualized certain phrases and semantics and sort of bigger text and visualized it. So it's a very, very smart technology, which we end up licensing. And what's quite interesting, I guess, is DaddiLife is probably the first thing that I've done that doesn't really feel sort of purely about business or commercial. Like there's a real, like for me, I still think of it as a passion project. It just so happens I can spend more time on it now, which is great. But that's kind of the mindset that I put to it. It really is my passion. I think it's fueled so much of who I am as a person and my identity. And I still couldn't imagine doing anything else at the moment, to be honest with you. I think I always love helping other entrepreneurs and other people who have grown their own businesses. I get a real kick from that. But as I guess DaddiLife is there, I feel like it's fulfilling a wider generational mission as well, in terms of if it can raise the spotlight on dads and maybe in this process create more of an equal playing field for dads and moms, actually, both at home and at work. Because for me, dads and mums aren't a separate entity. And I think sometimes, particularly in some of the work we see from a B2B side, there's a tendency to sometimes treat mums and dads quite differently. But actually, mums and dads, or working parents as a whole, represent about 72% of the UK's workforce. And when you think about that as a group of people, that is hugely influential. But I don't think sometimes that mums and dads or carers as a whole necessarily allied together in ways that might benefit them now and in the future. So that for me is a huge opportunity ahead as well.
And that just goes back to what you were saying before about assumptions, of role assumptions, and what we're sort of brought up to believe is the right role for us. And how actually we just sort of fall into a pattern sometimes without even realizing that we're doing it, until someone calls us out, or we talk to someone like you, or we see a resource and think, actually I can do something differently, or we can do something differently as a team. We can change the way the roles are working, but we just fall into this pattern of behavior without really challenging it.
It's so interesting, isn't it? Because if we look in the world around us, almost everything that we had grown up thinking in terms of a construct of family, or a construct of what 9 to 5 might be, all of those things are in flux. But yet actually, I think one of the last areas that's caught up to that is a sense of what modern family really is. So often I think we still are so tempted, not you and I, but I think society as a whole, we talk about mum and dad, but actually there are far more diverse makeups of family these days. There's mum and mum, dad and dad, dad and dad and dad and dad, and there's so many. Sometimes it's friends, it's there's so much interesting diversity that's happening. And I think the world of work especially, I think, has a lot to catch up on what true representation is for working parents.
And acknowledging all those exist.
Exactly. That would be a good start.
The right language, using the right language when they talk about these kind of things, which admittedly we don't do, because I know I still talk about mum and dad, just because that's what comes naturally to me. But I completely accept the fact we need to be changing our language across all the different potential setups that we have these days. So let's talk about.
I was just going to say, so I was on a live session yesterday with a wonderful lady called Claire Willets, who runs Not Only Pink and Blue, and even in that session, I had a reflection around just even how I sometimes talk about gender and gender stereotyping, which I am so sort of conscious of not, or of sort of guiding Max in the right way to not think in the way that I was brought up in thinking. But it's amazing just sometimes how we have so much more power and so much more opportunity to guide some of those conversations than maybe sometimes we think. So no, just reflecting on what you were saying there, you're absolutely right. And it's not like a right or wrong. It's not because you say mum and dad, that's a right or wrong thing. I think it's how we've been brought up in a lot of ways. But I think it's so interesting what's ahead for us as well.
So talk about what I love about DaddiLife, or part of what I love about DaddiLife, there's plenty to love about DaddiLife, is how you have taken sort of research angles. So you have, I'll look at my notes to make sure I get them right. So you've run the Millennial Dads at Work research project, the Dad Index, and also the Dads in Lockdown survey. And we'll talk about, I think today, the Millennial Dads at Work. I think it'll be quite relevant for today's audience. But I think as a passionate advocate for working parents, which I am, you are, everyone I have the pleasure to talk to is, it's often quite hard to find the evidence to back up what we know is true. We know in our heart is true. We build our businesses on knowing what's what the right thing to do is around working parents, but it often lacks that sort of evidential layer, the empirical layer, if you like. So what you're doing with your actual research-based DaddiLife projects is fantastic, because we can actually say these are the actual stats. This is actually what's going on. It's not just us saying that because we're, making up these stats. It's real. So what does the Millennial Dads at Work project survey tell us?
So I think every single year that I've run DaddiLife, we've done a piece of research that's looked at a different angle of modern day fatherhood. So as you mentioned, the Dad Index was the first one, and it looked at dads and their role at home to put, as you said, more empirical analysis into what's actually happening across the UK for modern day dads. And we had some amazing insight from there around certain routines and certain areas that dads were taking kind of more charge of, and certain areas where that quality for at home is happening quicker. And I think what we saw with that piece of research, though, is that there was, even though there was all this amazing change that was starting to happen at home and that has only been accelerated with COVID, there was still this massive tension and barrier when it came to dads at work. And so that's what actually led to our partnership with Deloitte and the Millennial Dad at Work, where we interviewed just over 2,000 working dads from every single region of the UK, and also every single industry as well profiled. And what we found was really profound in terms of the sort of way and shape and patterns of working that modern day dads want, and they feel would accommodate what they want in their own family goals, but actually a number of cultural barriers, whether that be line managers, whether that be colleagues, whether that be certain policies and programs. So to give you an example of that, we found that 14% of everyone that we interviewed had requested some form of flexible working. And in that particular case, there was another 14% of it who had requested to work from home 1 to 2 days a week. And this was done just prior to lockdown. So that was still something where you had to... And I
normal
think
normal life. This is a normal life context.
Exactly. But quite shockingly, only a tiny proportion of that, so less than 1 in 5, only 19% of that 14% got granted it. And if you think about working from home 1 to 2 days a week now, it would be just normal for so many people across so many industries. Not everyone, of course. There are certain roles where that can't be accommodated, and that's totally understandable. But there are other forms of flexible working that can be discussed. And I think what we saw with that as a result of that is that 1/3 of all the dads that we interviewed had actually left their jobs since becoming a dad in order to find far better parental and work balance. And another 1/3 on top of that were actively looking. And so you've got this essentially 2/3 of this modern dad audience who are in some sort of state of flux. And if we think about the attrition rates, the retention rates, the recruitment costs, all the rest of it, I mean, that is a profound cliff edge that a number of employers are walking into or running into. And so what we did is we followed that up with the Dad's Lockdown survey and actually found that those numbers had actually gone up. So in some cases, obviously, with flexible working, a lot of people across a lot of industries are working at home. So that was fine. But we asked them more about a future-facing way of working. What they want to do in the future. And actually a similar figure, so about 2/3 had said that they would want to continue this in the future to really show the consistency of that insight. But I think what was so encouraging is because Millennial Dad at Work was really focused on an audience age 24 to 40. Whereas Dad in Lockdown was pretty much everyone. And I think what was so encouraging is that you're now seeing this modern day fatherhood attitude starting to seep its way through all age groups of fatherhood. And I think that can only be so encouraging as long as we can grab the opportunities and the important positive lessons of what this has provided us.
So then that begs the question, if you have obviously a large proportion of working fathers looking for this flexibility and potentially leaving their current employers, whether they are determined to do it or they're still in that flux, I'm going to make an assumption, which you can definitely correct me if I'm wrong. There are surely not enough employers out there with the kind of jobs available, the flexible jobs available, to cater for all of these fathers wanting to move into that kind of area. So there's going to be a huge, I would assume, huge lack of potential flexible jobs for all these fathers who want them at the moment. I mean, obviously things change. Is that something you think is true?
I think if you'd asked me that question before lockdown, I would have said you were totally correct. I think what I've seen since lockdown and coming into what we're calling the next normal is I think it's forced employers, and I think this is where that question has almost been flipped on its head a little bit, in that what we've seen is far more transparency. And I think not just for working dads, but definitely for working mums and carers as a whole.
Yeah.
In terms of the ones that have been truly authentic, the ones that have been true to their word about actually wanting to embrace a new way of working.
Yeah.
And you only have to look at those pockets of resistance who don't necessarily want to go back into the office, or dads in banking, for instance, not to call out that sector, but I think that's been one sector where I've seen a lot more coverage of wanting to almost flip a switch and go back to the way things were, without necessarily recognizing all of the change that families have been through. And it really should be of no surprise, especially for those that become new fathers themselves in the last 18 months, that they've not really known a pattern of behavior of their daily routine, but being there 24/7 with their parents. And so I think you're absolutely right on the one hand that there probably is still a lack of supply. But I think what forward-thinking companies are doing is actually seeing that there are huge talent opportunities that they can bring into their organizations. And so the ones that are really, really forward-focused are reaping the rewards, because what we're seeing is, and whether it's startups or whether it's established corporations, we're seeing more and more working parents join those sorts of organizations and those sorts of teams. And I think as well, I guess what COVID has shown us as well is the shape of a 9 to 5 has been fundamentally challenged. So even within more traditional organizations, I suspect there is, and I think I've seen evidence of this, certainly for 2 organizations that we work with, of far more inherent flexibility, even in what we might see as a typical 9 to 5. So I think it's already starting to happen, but I think the ones that have really pushed the boat out and really gone, how can we future-proof ourselves so that we retain, engage, and really attract talent, have been the ones that are already reaping the rewards.
Yeah, because it's very easy, I think, also conversations I've had with working women and working men, is that some of the experiences they've had is the boxes are ticked to say, yes, flexible working is now 100% on the table. What do you want? How much do you want to work from home? But there are many examples, my husband being one of them. He starts work at 7 o'clock in the morning quite often because he's at home. So he goes downstairs and he's on his on the computer at 7, and he's still then working the normal working hours plus 2 hours extra probably on either side. So they are getting way more hours out of him than they were when he was commuting, and having that. We've talked about this a lot. Everybody's talked about the delineation between work and home, and how the commute was that mental delineation that actually you could read the paper or catch up with emails, but sort of in a much more relaxed way. Whereas now you're on and then you're off, and it's it's actually also quite hard, I think, mentally for people to switch off, because it's just there. The laptop is just there within your field of vision all day long. So I think I absolutely agree that there are more companies wanting to offer flexibility, wanting to be open to a conversation, but they still need to appreciate that just because you're home, it doesn't mean they can expect you to be online way earlier than they would have done pre-COVID and sort of the normal 9 to 5 hours.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think this is where it was France recently that they had decreed that anything that went over that allotted contracted hour was to be officially counted as overtime. And I think there is something in that, but whether that policy finds its way into the UK, I'm not sure. But I think there is an onus on us, and I think especially as working parents, to actually ally a bit here and to say, well, there does have to be a hard stop. And some of that is very culturally inflicted, in that it's a domino effect, because all it takes is one colleague who may or may not be a parent themselves to send that email or put that meeting time in, and suddenly these things creep.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think there is definitely, and I hear you loud and clear, that there is, I would say, an urgency and a good challenge around how can we just create those hard lines. And I think in a way, that we've talked. So I mean, something we often talk about DaddiLife is how do dads, and the work we do with employers is, how do you allow dads to bring their dad identity to work? And so often we just don't. We don't enough. We enter that door physically or digitally, and we become that person. But actually, when we can start to show people that we are more than that person, that there's this other side to us and this other dimension, it's amazing the sort of change and empathy that can be experienced. And I think it brings me back to your question, because I think if we can bring more of that side to the equation and just make super clear what are those red lines, and I think I haven't heard enough of an en masse collective of people saying this is our red line, and it's a tricky thing to do. It's a very easy thing for me in my position to say. It is a far trickier thing to do, but this is where I think that conversation of working parents and a team and an organization can start to come together, because they are far more powerful force than maybe we realize at the moment.
Yeah, it's definitely a collective view needs to be brought to the fore more. And the empathy word you used earlier is interesting, because I think you're absolutely right. We should all be bringing our whole selves to work. Whatever we have at home, whatever the setup is, we should bring our whole selves to work, because especially in leadership positions, we all know that empathy is an amazing leadership quality and trait. But often if you leave yourself at home, whether that's as a mother, a father, a carer, whatever, and you don't bring those qualities into the workplace, you're missing a huge trick, because actually bringing the whole part of you to work makes you a much better worker, employee, leader, colleague, all of these things, and vice versa. So I think it's important for all of us to actually, as you say, to not be one-dimensional at work, but bring our whole selves.
It's so interesting, because I think men struggle with it, and I know that's a very big, broad stereotype. But for all the dads at work that I've ever had the pleasure of working with, I've not met a single one who hasn't had even a small challenge about bringing the whole selves. And I remember we ran a dad mentor program that matched internal dads and dads to be with external mentors, called Dad Connect. We ran that with Nikki from the Parent Mentor and then Nadia from Avenir. And it was great fun, because it gave us such a great insight into some of those barriers and some of those safe spaces that some dads just simply don't feel they have in some organizations. And one of the mentors that we had, Tim Hole, who was at Breathe Labs and now Sky, brilliant guy. And he had this analogy, which is still with me to this day, because it just represented, I think, so much of what you're talking about, which was that he said that before fatherhood, men are like solid blocks. They know where they want to be, they have a certain routine and a certain way of doing things. He said, and then fatherhood comes along and it turns them into bendy lines. And we have to adjust and flex to things in ways that we've never thought possible. And I suspect that same transition is as true for mothers, well, I'm sure it is, as it is for fathers. But I think the one of the differences is that, and this goes back to your point about how we were brought up, because I think men are so used to, and sometimes when we look at our peers and previous generations of dads who maybe have done parenting a little differently, that bendy line hasn't always been as obvious. And I think bringing that whole self to work can sometimes be a scary thing for a lot of men. I think I've heard of a lot of horror stories really of men who have come back from, say, shared parental leave and been given the so-called grunt work or been put on the B league. And I know that similar things happen, if not actually at a worse scale, for a lot of mums as well. And I think this is where there needs to start to be that progression, because it's a really scary thing, but also the people that can be the pioneers of that conversation can really inspire some incredible cultural change. But I totally accept that actually for a lot of people it is a really scary thing.
It's just that fear of being judged, isn't it? It's a fear of putting yourself out there and saying, this is actually me. And then someone judging you because of whatever it is you're presenting. And we just don't want that to happen at work, because we want to keep things simple, just sort of get on with it, do our jobs and not have to face up to some of those, I think, which is it's not the right thing, obviously, but hence why it's so scary.
Yeah, I think particularly if you're the first one to do it and you're in maybe a more traditional industry or a traditional corporation, you can find yourselves, I think, being quite isolated quite quickly. I think that's where we've seen sort of interventions of where we've been able to bring dads together or dads and mums together. I think that sense of collective voice, as to your point earlier, is therefore even more important. And I definitely see that as an opportunity ahead for a lot of organisations, and I think the parents within them specifically.
So where do you think, so DaddiLife, very successful, is building, great inroads into all of these things we're talking about. Where do you want DaddiLife to go over the next year, 3 year, 5 years? What can you see sort of, how's it going to expand and grow?
It's a good question. I ask myself that on a daily basis. I mean, to be honest with you, I think, so in my, it was my third job, I used to have to put massive marketing plans and business plans together, and they used to be like 5-year trajectories. I think that the world is now so fast paced. I'm going to show my age here, but the world is so fast paced, and there are lessening barriers to entry for pretty much everything. I think if you think about, I was looking at a documentary earlier this morning before this call that was talking about, Apple looking at electric cars. And if you look at that industry, it's been so traditional for so long, and that is a really hard industry to get into. And I guess what I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is sort of making 5-year plans, frankly, I don't think is really worth the paper it's printed on these days, or digitally printed on. And so we often think, to be honest, year by year, what are the things that is really, really going to make a difference for dads? What are the areas that we can positively impact? And so actually one of the research projects we just completed at the end of last year was with Leeds Trinity University and Research England on young fathers, and why young fathers in particular, and I think this will be an increasing focus of the next few years, is we see a really big emerging disparity between dads. I think often this kind of quite media savvy perception of quite middle class dads who, have got successful careers, who've got families, who it's all smiles and it's all joy, but there is also this growing undercurrent of younger dads who don't have the access to the same resources, are not as set in their careers, who are still growing a lot themselves.
And when you say younger, how much younger are we talking? What sort of part of the population?
So it was literally from sort of late teens through to early 20s. So these are still young adults, I would say. And there is this increasing disparity between the access, the support services, the things that actually fundamentally create thriving family. And so that's definitely one area that we're increasingly interested in, because it's one of those things that isn't talked about enough, or really at all, but it's something that actually, if left to its own devices, unfortunately will be even deeper and even darker. So I think that's one area we can definitely affect more positively. I think there will be a couple more books that come out. We're writing one at the moment. We're about to launch another one for Christmas, which is totally on a different scale. It's not necessarily as serious. It's a knock-knock joke book, actually. But we like to have a bit of fun as well.
Is it a load of dad jokes?
It's basically like dad jokes, load of them. So we've got a dad joke book already. So this is like the perfect companion for that. And so we'll be doing a couple more books, I'm sure, over the next few years. They take an awful long time to write.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But they're good fun. They're really good fun to do. I think we'll continue to grow the platform. So there are so many areas that are still to be achieved in terms of content areas, in terms of community areas. I mean, we've just launched a scheme called Winning Winter on social, which is how can we challenge dads in particular to sort of show us their own creativity for winter activities. And we're celebrating the dads and the mums, the parents as a whole, that are doing that. And we just have some lovely support from Action for Children and a few others who are getting involved with that too. So I think what we want to do is just, I guess, keep progressing the conversations that need to happen for modern day families. I think we have a particular advantage point of it from a dad's point of view, but we work with a number of different parental organizations. And so that for me would be success. Can we continue to advance the agenda around working parents? Because I think even though we've made tremendous progress, not we necessarily as DaddiLife, but a number of organizations, yourself, working moms and various other people, I think there's still so much to do. And I think in many ways, COVID has, even though it's accelerated positive change for many, it's also accelerated really negative change for a lot of others. And so in a way, we're left with a place where in the next normal, I hope that we can increase our work even more to just equalize the playing field, because there's still an awful lot to be done there.
Yeah, and just sparked a thought when you talk about the young fathers, because it's not really something I've come across in my work or my conversations. And presumably, as a young father or young mother, and a young adult, actually, when you're a late teen, early 20s, it's made me personal experience. I didn't know who I was as a person. You know, I don't know when I found out. Maybe when I hit 40, I found out who I was. So certainly as a young adult, you not only are trying to work out who you are, but then you've also got this baby thrown in the mix,
absolutely,
demanding everything of you. And that is obviously, as you say, a completely different path and journey to an older adult who's maybe got their career sorted, or sort of generally knows what their path might be. Still thrown off guard when the baby arrives, but two very, very different journeys. So that's going to be a fascinating addition, I think, to your conversations, because it's not something I've come across as much yet.
No, you're absolutely right. I think, you know, one of the things, I think the thing that's without getting too deep with you, Aisha, is...
No, please do.
It's
a safe
very
space.
I'd say doing the research, I find genuinely humbling. And the young fathers research in particular, I think, opened my eyes to struggles that not just young fathers, but definitely young mothers are going through right across the UK. And it's a very, very cyclical thing, as in, once you take something away or something isn't an access that they once had, the road to negativity and the spiral to that is quick, and through absolutely no fault of their own, something that unfortunately then grows other behaviors that our society sees as undesirable. And that isn't because of a lack of motivation or lack of, you know, want, but I think a pure need to provide can lead a lot of families to very dark paths. And that's I think that's what I mean by something so humbling, and why I'm so committed to it, is that it's a sort of thing that unless we can really put our heart and soul into, as well as progressing things, you know, for what we see and hear around, it's going to create even more division. And I think, you know, hopefully what you've got a sense from me is that I'm on a bit of a mission to try and upweight fatherhood, not just necessarily how we talk about it or how we see it, but sometimes in just the standards that we hold ourselves accountable for as men, to be honest with you. So a lot of what we talk about is like mental load, and things that we know that still predominance of mothers kind of carry a far heavier mental load than men do. But I think for young fatherhood in particular, there are some real pathways. And so for Millennial Dad at Work, we'll talk about pathways like flexible working, we'll talk about pathways like line management. For young fathers, we talk about pathways like education and just higher education. Is that an option for you? You know, employment. What employment opportunities are available? What are the support services that need to happen? So we've actually set up a bit of a committee. The Department of Work and Pensions are represented in that, and a few others as well, to put this on the agenda, because it's one of those things that isn't going away, and actually is a very, trying to find the right way to put this, is a really fast growing problem that actually, unless it's put right to the top of government agenda, isn't going to be solved as quick as it needs to be.
And also that fast growing problem ends up being a long-term problem as they obviously get older and et cetera, et cetera.
Exactly.
It's not a problem for
and
now.
their children as well.
Exactly. It's perpetuated sort of ad infinitum.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Nip in the bud is not quite, you know, it sounds a bit trite, but you have to nip it in the bud.
Yeah, no, you do. And I think some of the solutions around it aren't even necessarily, you know, they're not even necessarily big solutions. They're not reinventing the wheel. They're just putting certain things in place that sometimes even stops a domino in the first place, and then can grow from there. And I think there's not enough of that that's happening at the moment. So so I think we'll definitely be doing our best to be advancing that area for sure.
Yeah, and I would love to be involved in that. If there's anything I can do to help, or I think it's a fascinating sort of addition to this working parent conversation, is actually looking at the younger parents and how they fit into the equation.
Well, there is actually just so I'll kind of do this separately, because there is a bid that we're putting together on that at the moment, actually. So we'll definitely loop you into that. Yeah,
that'd be great. So I think we're gonna run out of time. We are going out of time. But I just wanted to ask you, this is purely for my own knowledge, your background, your name, Hanson Lee.
Yeah.
And as a fellow non-English, English born, but obviously my name Aisha is not English. What is in a very brief nutshell, what is your background?
In very brief terms, before expanding slightly, I'm a real melting pot. So I am part Chinese, part Malaysian, part Spanish. So my mother's side is sort of Chinese and Malaysian. My father's side is also Chinese Malaysian, but he has, unfortunately, like, they divorced us when I was very young. But I know that his own background had some European influence in there as well. What's even more, if I took your question and took it to the next generation, so Max, and he takes real pride in saying this, because Jess, his mum, we're no longer together, but I think we do a great job co-parenting him. And luckily we've been able to remain great friends. So she is part Guyanese, part English.
Okay.
So he is like, if my melting pot is this, his is like this. So he is part Chinese, Malaysian, Spanish, Guyanese, and English.
And what he refers to himself as then?
Yeah, it's a good question.
When he's asked.
A good question.
It's similar to my kids. My kids are part Sri Lankan, Indian, Welsh, English, and Scottish.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Well, I am all those things as well, but and then my husband's English. They've got more English than I have.
Okay.
Because my husband's fully English. But I've got the melting pot. They've inherited as well. So when people often think we're Spanish or Italian, but we're actually I'm half Asian, half British, I suppose. In simple terms, but it's a massive melting pot. So I think my daughter, my older one, who's more aware of it, I think she loves it. I think she loves saying that she's got family in India and she's got family in Singapore and she's got, I think she just likes to be able to. It's a nice story, I think, to be able to tell.
Absolutely.
It's quite. It's a very good example of our modern society, I think. All of these melting pots.
I hope so. I think it's definitely a good foundation.
It is. So thank you so much. I've just, as I knew would be the case, we've had plenty to talk about, and we could talk about plenty more. If people want to find out more about Daddylife or more about you or anything else we've talked about, where's the best place to find you?
So we are daddylife.com on the interweb. But that's daddy with an I, so DADDI life.com. Our books on Amazon. So we've actually got 2 at the moment, The Dad Joke a Day, if you want a good Christmas gift. And You're Going to Be a Dad on Amazon too. And on social, we are at DaddyLife across all of them, except on Twitter, where someone else has got DaddyLife. We're still in discussions with that one. Right. So we're Life Daddy on Twitter, but everywhere else DaddyLife. Perfect.
Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Have a lovely rest of day, and I will speak to you very soon. We'll connect separately about the young adult.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks, Hanson.
Thanks, Aisha.